Hi there, welcome to the Please Sleep channel. Tonight, we're going all the way back to ancient Egypt, the land of golden tombs, mysterious gods, and miserable lives. Sure, being a pharaoh might sound incredible. Living in palaces, commanding armies, building massive pyramids, being worshipped like a god, but in reality, it was mostly back pain from heavy crowns, endless rituals, family betrayal, and getting blamed when the Nile didn't flood. And if you thought regular people had it better, think again. Scribes wrote until their fingers went numb. Farmers depended on a river that didn't care whether they lived or died. Embalmers had to deal with dead bodies in the desert heat. And slaves, well, they built an empire and barely got a thank you. Ancient Egypt may look glamorous in the history books, but we're here to show you the sand-covered truth. No makeup, no Hollywood, just sweat, sun, and suffering. So get comfortable, because for the next hour, we're going to show you why it absolutely sucked to be an Egyptian pharaoh. And everyone else too. This is why it sucked to be an Egyptian pharaoh. Let's begin. Being a pharaoh sounds incredible until you actually try to be one. At first glance, you'd think being the living god of one of the world's greatest ancient civilizations would be the ultimate dream job. You get to live in palaces, wear golden crowns, be worshipped by millions, and have your face carved into stone for eternity. But peel back the golden mask, and what you get is a lifetime of exhaustion, paranoia, impossible expectations, and sweating through layers of ceremonial linen. Pharaohs weren't just rulers, they were the physical embodiment of divine order, cosmic balance, and the stability of the universe itself. That's a lot of pressure for one person, especially when that person is expected to perform non-stop rituals, micromanage the gods, and pretend like everything is fine while the Nile refuses to flood. One bad year, one poor harvest, one inconvenient solar eclipse, and suddenly you're not a god anymore. You're just the guy who let Egypt fall apart. Being a pharaoh wasn't a political role, it was a metaphysical job. Your calendar wasn't filled with state meetings or tea parties, it was stacked with religious festivals, solar ceremonies, offerings to deities, sacred cattle inspections, and extremely symbolic boat rides. You didn't get to say no to any of it. Skipping rituals meant offending the gods. Offending the gods meant droughts, disease, rebellion, or worse, being forgotten. And in ancient Egypt, being forgotten was worse than death. That's why pharaohs obsessed over legacy, building monuments taller than any ego has the right to be. But even that wasn't enough. The afterlife required more than just tombs. You had to have your name spoken, your body preserved, and your soul judged by Osiris in a very stressful post-death performance review. But before all that, you had to survive being alive. Day-to-day life for a pharaoh was a non-stop exercise in godlike endurance. Wake up, that's a ritual. Eat breakfast, ritual. Inspect the temple, extremely important ritual. Everything from shaving to walking had a symbolic meaning, and every misstep could be interpreted as a sign that Egypt was in decline. The priests were always watching. They were your advisors, sure, but they also held enormous power, and could make or break your reign if you upset the wrong god or skipped to the wrong feast day. And unlike modern advisors, they spoke in riddles, dreams, and goat entrails. Good luck navigating politics when half your cabinet believes Horus is sending messages through bird migration patterns. On top of religious obligations, pharaohs also had to be military leaders. That meant riding chariots in the desert sun, leading campaigns into Nubia or Syria, and trying not to die from an infected arrow wound, because ancient medicine involved honey and crocodile dung. If you stayed home, you were weak. If you lost a battle, you were cursed. And if you won, congratulations, you now had more prisoners to feed and another monument to build. Speaking of building, pharaohs were obsessed with construction not because they were fans of architecture, but because it was the only way to prove they existed. The bigger the temple, the more immortal your legacy. But that meant managing massive labor forces, organizing food supplies for thousands of workers, coordinating deliveries of granite from quarries hundreds of kilometers away, and praying that your engineers didn't mess up the angles on your burial chamber or cause the whole thing to collapse. And this wasn't a one-year project. Some pharaohs spent decades trying to finish their pyramids, only to die before the capstone was placed. Others tried to outdo their predecessors by building even bigger tombs, draining the treasury in the process, and leaving their successors scrambling for tax revenue. Royal life also came with the added bonus of constant family betrayal. Pharaohs often married their sisters to preserve divine bloodlines, which didn't exactly lead to healthy family dynamics. Add to that the fact that a pharaoh could have dozens of wives and children, and you've got a royal court full of scheming half-siblings, ambitious queens, jealous concubines, and advisors who smile to your face while sharpening daggers behind your back. Every family dinner was a potential assassination attempt, and since succession wasn't always clear-cut, any sign of weakness like falling ill or being childless could spark a civil war. Of course, being a god didn't make you immune to normal problems. You could still get food poisoning, suffer migraines, or have terrible eyesight, but you couldn't let anyone know. Gods don't get stomach aches. They don't have bad hair days. They don't yawn during ceremonies, so you had to pretend all the time, constantly performing. constantly watched. You were a prisoner in your own palace, draped in gold and crushed by expectations. Even death wasn't restful. The process of dying for a pharaoh was bureaucratic, gruesome, and terrifying. Your body had to be perfectly preserved. Your tomb had to be sealed with the right spells. Your soul had to pass the weighing of the heart ceremony, and if it didn't, you'd be devoured by a demon with the head of a crocodile and the body of a lion. No pressure, and even if everything went right, your tomb would probably be robbed within a few decades anyway. Grave robbing was practically a tradition. All those treasures, all that planning, all those golden statues you were buried with, gone, stolen by someone who probably sold your favorite ceremonial dagger for a jug of beer. In the end, being a pharaoh was less about power and more about performance. You had to perform being divine, perform being strong, perform being eternal. But beneath the layers of ritual, gold, and divine titles, you were still human, tired, stressed, paranoid, constantly trying to hold together an empire where the gods were fickle, the priests were ambitious, and the Nile had a habit of not cooperating. You weren't the master of Egypt, you were its most overworked employee. So the next time you see a massive statue of Ramses II or a golden mask in a museum, remember this. Behind that stoic expression was probably a man who hadn't slept properly in 20 years, was deeply constipated from eating ceremonial bread, and was quietly wondering if his nephew was trying to stab him. That's the true face of power in ancient Egypt, not glory, not majesty, but exhaustion. Every pharaoh wanted to be remembered forever. And in ancient Egypt, that meant one thing: building a monument so massive, so expensive, and so absurdly difficult that it could literally survive the end of the world. Enter the pyramid. Giant stone triangles in the desert that served as elaborate tombs and cosmic elevators for your soul. On paper, they were majestic. In reality, they were decades-long construction nightmares that slowly destroyed your sanity, drained your kingdom's treasury, and often weren't even finished by the time you died. But pharaohs didn't really have a choice. Your pyramid was your legacy. If you didn't build one, or if you built a small one, or if you died before it was done, and your successor hated you, your name would vanish from history. And in Egyptian culture, being forgotten after death was the worst possible fate. So every new pharaoh, often from the moment he took the throne, had to start building his tomb, managing a national infrastructure project on a scale that would make modern engineers weep. The logistics were overwhelming. You needed thousands of workers, skilled architects, enormous quarries, boats to transport limestone, food supplies, and above all, time. Lots of time. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, took around 20 years to build, using over 2 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. And they didn't have cranes. They had ropes, levers, and pure human misery. These weren't slaves, by the way, at least, not in the traditional sense. Most pyramid workers were paid laborers, given bread, beer, onions, and sometimes housing, but it wasn't glamorous. They lived in cramped work camps, broke their backs hauling rocks under the desert sun, and risked injury or death every day. The pharaoh, of course, didn't haul stones himself, but managing the project meant making constant decisions about materials, workers, religious alignment, security, budgeting, and the all-important angle of the pyramid walls. Get the angle wrong, and the whole thing collapses. Literally, that's what happened with the bent pyramid. Someone miscalculated. Whoops. Also, pyramids weren't just big triangles. There were complex spiritual machines. You had to include shafts for the soul to escape, secret chambers for treasure, perfectly carved hieroglyphs to guide the dead, and elaborate traps to deter grave robbers. Spoiler, the traps didn't work. Most pyramids were looted within a century. The only reason we even know what was in Tutankhamun's tomb is because it was buried under another tomb and forgotten. Every other pharaoh's tomb, pretty much empty. But they didn't know that yet. So pharaohs poured everything they had into their tombs, trying to outdo their ancestors. Bigger, fancier, more sacred. You couldn't build a second biggest pyramid. That was embarrassing. You couldn't reuse someone else's plans. That was lazy. You had to have your own architectural statement, your own divine elevator to the stars. And the pressure wasn't just spiritual, it was political. The people needed to see their pharaoh doing something monumental. Building a pyramid showed power, wealth, control over labor, and closeness to the gods. If you didn't build one, people questioned your legitimacy. Maybe you weren't really chosen by Ra, maybe the gods were angry. Maybe it was time for a new dynasty, and heaven help you if you ran out of money halfway through. More than one pharaoh had to leave his pyramid unfinished because of war, famine, or civil unrest. In those cases, your priests might quickly convert a small tomb or cave into your final resting place, cramming your golden sarcophagus into a hole and hoping no one noticed. That's why some pharaohs are found in tombs way too small for their titles, because their grand plans were cut short by inconvenient reality. There were also maintenance costs. Even after the pyramid was finished, you had to staff a team of priests to maintain rituals at the mortuary temple, feed offerings to your statue, and keep the divine memory alive. If your successor didn't like you, he might stop paying for those priests, and you'd slowly vanish from the spiritual realm. All that stone and suffering, wasted. And let's not forget the paranoia. Pyramids were constantly targeted by tomb robbers, which meant your builders also had to include fake doors, hidden passageways, cursed inscriptions, and elaborate traps. Some pharaohs even placed decoy tombs elsewhere, hoping thieves would take the bait. But robbers were persistent, and eventually even the best planned pyramid became a hollow shell. Some robbers were caught, but many weren't. And sometimes, the people looting your tomb were your own descendants, trying to finance their own building projects. How's that for family loyalty? By the end of the New Kingdom, pharaohs stopped building pyramids entirely. They moved to the Valley of the Kings, cutting tombs into the mountains to hide them, out of sight, out of loot. But even that didn't work for long. Almost every royal tomb in the valley was eventually plundered. And still, pharaohs kept trying, because legacy mattered more than logic. You couldn't just be buried, you had to be buried correctly, with spells, and treasure, and status symbols. Because if you weren't remembered, you didn't exist in the afterlife. Your soul would wander, lost and hungry, forever. That's what they feared. That's what drove them to spend their lives and fortunes in tombs. And here's the kicker. We remember the pyramids, but we don't know who built most of them. We've lost their names, their stories, their glory. The very thing they feared happened anyway. The desert is patient. Time erases kings, and somewhere, beneath layers of sand and silence, their monuments crumble in the heat. Being pharaoh wasn't just a job, it was a high, full-time gamble where the people most likely to kill you were the ones who lived in your house. Forget foreign invaders, forget drought, forget angry priests. The real danger came from your own family. Because when you sit on a throne made of gold, everyone wants a piece of it. Royal succession in ancient Egypt was rarely straightforward. Pharaohs had many wives, and those wives had many children. Some were full siblings, others were half. Some were cousins who were also technically In short, it was complicated. There were no hard rules about who should inherit the throne. Sometimes it was the eldest son. Sometimes it was the son of the most politically connected wife. Sometimes it was the general who married your daughter. And sometimes it was whoever killed you first. The palace was a powder keg of ambition. Every wife wanted her son to be pharaoh. Every prince thought he deserved the crown. And every royal servant knew they had job security as long as they kept smiling and never picked sides. Of course, pharaohs tried to maintain control. They appointed crown princes, gave out titles, arranged strategic marriages, and built propaganda monuments to show divine favor. But none of that mattered if you died suddenly or if someone helped you die suddenly. Poisoning was popular. So was smothering. So was disappearing mysteriously in the night. The line of succession often changed not because of law or tradition, but because of who had the strongest army, the cleverest wife, or the most ambitious mother. Women, by the way, played a major role in these deadly soap operas. Queens could be powerful, especially the great royal wife, who often served as co-regent or high priestess. But the palace was full of minor wives, daughters of nobles, foreign princesses, and other women who had ambitions of their own. Some genuinely wanted to help their husbands rule. Others just wanted their sons on the throne. There were queens who ruled as regents for underage pharaohs, and some who simply took power themselves. Hatshepsut dressed like a man and ruled for decades. Cleopatra fought off 2 brothers. Women in the palace were not passive figures, they were political players in Silken Island, and they could be just as ruthless as any general. Princes, meanwhile, grew up in a strange mix of luxury and paranoia. They were educated in writing, military arts, and theology, but they also knew that any mistake could cost them their future or their life. Some were exiled, some imprisoned, some quietly erased from the records. And even if you became pharaoh, you couldn't relax. Your brothers were still alive, your nephews still wanted your job, and if your wife had sons from another marriage, you'd better keep an eye on the dinner wine. Sibling rivalry in the palace wasn't just about stealing toys, it was about stealing kingdoms. Even the bureaucracy wasn't safe. Viziers, high priests, military commanders, many of them came from noble families connected to the royal household. Some were loyal, others had their own agendas. If a pharaoh died without a strong heir, it was often these men who stepped in and advised the new ruler. Sometimes they were helpful, sometimes they declared themselves king, and if you were pharaoh and got too friendly with one advisor, the others might start to panic and plot. All this meant that being pharaoh required constant political awareness. You couldn't trust anyone, not even your own children, especially not your own children. Ramses III, for example, was murdered in a palace conspiracy involving one of his wives and her son. The plot was so complex that even the ancient Egyptians had to hold a giant courtroom drama about it, complete with forced confessions and people being executed or exiled to commit suicide on command. And that's one of the few we actually know about. Most conspiracies were successful or successfully covered up. We can only guess how many pharaohs were quietly removed from power by natural causes that looked suspiciously convenient. To stay alive, pharaohs had to balance competing factions, marry strategically, and constantly remind everyone that they were divinely chosen. Temples were built not just to honor the gods, but to legitimize your rule. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to secure the throne for your heir. If you weren't, your tomb was left unfinished, your name was scratched out of monuments, and your successor claimed you were a tyrant possessed by evil spirits. Speaking of that, Egyptian history is full of bad kings who were conveniently declared illegitimate after death. That wasn't always because they were bedit, was often because the next ruler wanted to erase them. Damnatio memoria was real. If your enemies had enough influence, they could literally delete you from history. Your statues were smashed, your name chiseled out, your memory forgotten, and in Egyptian belief, that meant your soul ceased to exist. Pharaohs weren't just afraid of dying, they were afraid of being erased. That's why they obsessed over building monuments, repeating their names and inscriptions, making sure priests would perform rites for them after death. But even that wasn't enough. If your family hated you or wanted your stuff, in the end, the greatest threat to a pharaoh's life, legacy, and afterlife wasn't rebellion or famine or invading Hittites. It was family. The people who knew your secrets, your weaknesses, your habits. The people who could smile in front of the court while plotting your downfall behind a curtain. The people you had to marry, promote, and trust because they were family. And in ancient Egypt, family was everything, especially when it came to stabbing you in the back. Let's talk about comfort, or rather, the complete lack of it, because while Hollywood might show Egyptian palaces as breezy, candlelit oases filled with silk curtains and perfumed pools, the reality was far more miserable. Being pharaoh didn't protect you from the basic climate of your kingdom, and Egypt, for all its greatness, was hot, not a little sweaty hot. We're talking endless, suffocating, bone-drying, desert heat, where temperatures could soar past 40 degrees Celsius, and the only shade came from mud brick walls that radiated the sun back at you like a convection oven. Palaces were built of limestone and sandstone materials that absorb heat all day and release it slowly all night. Air circulation was primitive at best. The so-called ventilation involved small slits in the walls or holes near the ceiling, which only let in hot air and the occasional fly. Ceiling fans? No. Palm fronds. Sure, if you could convince a servant to fan you for 10 straight hours without stopping, sneezing, or dying of heat stroke. And pharaohs, of course, had to dress the part. That meant heavy ceremonial collars made of gold, stone, and beads, stiff linen kilts, elaborate headdresses, false beards tied to the chin with string, and layers of cosmetics. You didn't just wake up and throw on something comfortable. You had to be styled, painted, bejeweled. Even your sweat had to look royal. Wigs were mandatory for formal occasions, and they weren't light. They were thick, heavy, and often made of human hair glued together with beeswax and resin. Great for appearances, terrible for airflow. Wearing one in the summer was like strapping a hot animal to your head and pretending everything was fine. Your sandals, flat, stiff, no arch support, no cushioning, no ankle straps. Just enough sole to keep you from burning your feet on sun-baked flagstones. Unless, of course, the leather had cracked, then you were on your own. Want to cool down? Too bad. Private pools were rare, and bathing in the Nile meant risking parasites, crocodiles, or drifting too close to a dead donkey upstream. Water was precious and stored in heavy ceramic jars, so unless you were actively melting in front of someone important, nobody was wasting a whole jar on a midday splash. But let's say you made it through the heat. Now you had to deal with the bugs. Egypt was and still is full of flies, mosquitoes, and every other kind of buzzing, biting, crawling insect you can imagine. They got in your food, your clothes, your bed, and your ears. Pharaohs burned incense constantly, not just for the gods, but to keep the insects from chewing their faces off during official ceremonies. Some wore protective amulets against scorpion stings or slept under nets if they were lucky enough to have them. Most simply, endure. And because hygiene standards were based more on ritual purity than germ theory, your personal bath time was dependent on religious schedules, not personal preference. You might go days or weeks without a full body wash, especially during ceremonies when your body was considered too sacred to touch common water. Instead, you'd be anointed with oils, sprinkled with perfumed powders, and layered with more makeup, essentially hiding the dirt under fancier dirt. Speaking of perfume, ancient Egyptians loved to smell good, but their perfumes weren't always light and floral. Some were made from animal fat, myrrh, and fermented plant extracts that turned rancid in the heat. Combine that with a lack of deodorant, and you start to understand why palace corridors were filled with the scent of desperation, incense, and slowly rotting rose oil. Sleeping wasn't much better. Beds were made of wood or stone with woven leather straps, usually angled upward so your feet hung off. Pillows made of carved headrests that supported your neck at an angle so uncomfortable, you'd swear it was punishment. There were no fans, no windows that opened, just a hot, silent room, full of still air, flickering oil lamps, and the ever-present hum of insects. You'd think the pharaoh had access to the best food and drink in the land, and technically, that was true. But even that had problems. Bread was coarse and filled with bits of stone from the grinding process. which wore down your teeth and gave you chronic jaw pain. Meat spoiled quickly in the heat, and beer was often warm, sour, and floating with sediment. Fruit was seasonal, vegetables were basic, meals were repetitive, and all of it had to be eaten politely, under the gaze of servants, priests, or Jale's family members, while maintaining an aura of divine elegance. Got a stomachache? Good luck. Medical treatments involved honey, herbs, and prayers. No refrigeration, no antibiotics, and definitely no And if you were really sick, the court might start whispering about omens, curses, or divine punishment. Nobody wanted a sick pharaoh. Sick pharaohs had a habit of dying, and dying pharaohs made everyone nervous, but let's assume you survived the day. You finished the rituals. You endured the council meetings. You survived the heat, the outfits, the bugs, and the ceremonial dinner. You returned to your private chambers, collapsed into your stone-framed bed, laid your waxy wig on a stand, and closed your eyes, only to wake up hours later in a pool of your own sweat, bitten by mosquitoes, your ears ringing with the sound of temple drums starting the next dawn ceremony. Because in Egypt, the gods never sleep, and neither, it seems, did the pharaoh. If you thought being pharaoh meant giving a few speeches and waving from balconies, think again, because in ancient Egypt literally everything was a ritual. From waking up in the morning to clipping your fingernails, every single action had symbolic meaning and divine consequences. And as the living embodiment of Ma'at cosmic order, it was your job to do all of it correctly, every single day forever. That meant your life wasn't your own. It was scheduled according to temple calendars, planetary alignments, flood cycles, and the moods of various animal-headed gods who demanded offerings, ceremonies, and perfect pronunciation of complicated incantations. Forget sleeping in. Your day started before dawn, with purification rites. Priests would wake you, help you wash, chant things while rubbing you with oils, and prepare you to face the divine duties of the morning. Then came the first wave of rituals: feeding statues, lighting sacred fires, offering bread and beer to Horus, Isis, Ra, or whichever god was in charge of Tuesday. You didn't get to decide. The gods had a schedule, and you had to follow it. Even if you were tired, sick, or mildly possessed, you were expected to appear in full regalia, recite memorized prayers, perform hand gestures in precise sequence, and not mess anything up. If you did mess up, it wasn't just embarrassing. It was a spiritual failure. One wrong move, one mispronounced word, and the priests might interpret it as a sign that the gods were displeased. And when the gods were displeased, they sent signs, plagues, droughts, or losing your next war. So no pressure. And this wasn't a once-a-week thing. Rituals happened daily, hourly, seasonally, and according to overlapping solar, lunar, and agricultural calendars. You'd finish one ceremony, sit down to catch your breath, and immediately be told that it was time for the festival of the beautiful valley, or the opening of the mouth, or the 5-day feast of Opet, all of which required more processions, more offerings, more robes, and more public smiling. And speaking of robes, you had to wear specific outfits for different rituals. Linen had to be freshly woven and ritually purified. Colors mattered. Jewelry had to match the theme. If it was a lunar ceremony, silver amulets, solar, gold. Ritual for Osiris, green, black, maybe a crown with feathers. If you wore the wrong thing, the gods might misinterpret your outfit as an insult. Or worse, your high priests might use it as an excuse to replace you with someone who understood sacred fashion better. You also couldn't perform many rituals alone. That would be too easy. Instead, you were accompanied by teams of priests, musicians, dancers, scribes, and animal handlers, each with their own ritual checklists. Your job was to be the centerpiece of this divine stage play, remembering your lines and not accidentally knocking over an incense pot. Sometimes you had to walk through temples barefoot, scattering grain for symbolic fertility. Sometimes you had to climb stairs while holding a sacred object and chanting through a mask. Sometimes you had to pretend to hunt a symbolic hippo. The rituals made no practical sense, but they made symbolic sense, and that was more important. Because Egypt didn't separate politics from religion, every act of statecraft was also an act of worship. Taxes were divine tribute. Wars were sacred justice. Harvests were cosmic gifts. If the harvest failed, it meant the pharaoh had failed. If a comet passed overhead, it meant the pharaoh had missed a ritual. If a frog croaked weirdly during a ceremony, it meant something, and it was never good. Even your personal hygiene had to follow ritual protocols. You didn't just bathe. You underwent purification with natron salts, holy water, and incense. You didn't just eat lunch. You offered symbolic portions to the gods first, blessed your food, and consumed it with ritual utensils in a specific posture. You didn't just sleep. You recited protective spells, aligned your bed with sacred stars, and slept with amulets to guard against demons in your dreams. You weren't even free when you died. Your burial required 70 days of embalming, dozens of ritual texts, hundreds of objects placed in the right chambers, and the correct performance of the opening of the mouth ceremony to ensure your soul could breathe in the afterlife. Miss a step, and your soul might get eaten by a crocodilian hippo monster named Amit. But until then, you were stuck in a life where nothing could be done simply. You couldn't open a door without symbolic meaning. You couldn't walk through a garden without invoking the gods of fertility. You couldn't sneeze without someone offering you an amulet. And yes, even sneezing had a ritual explanation. It was believed to expel evil spirits. So if you sneezed too many times, your high priest might schedule an emergency purification ceremony. And if that ceremony clashed with the festival of the lotus bloom, well, tough luck. You'd have to do both. The bureaucracy of the gods didn't allow cancellations. The weight of these endless rituals wasn't just physical, it was psychological. You had no room to be yourself. You were always performing, always watched, always compared to the gods who came before you. If you didn't live up to the expectations, your name could be erased from the walls. And if your name was erased, you were gone. Forever, no afterlife, no soul, just sand. That's why so many pharaohs built temples to themselves, not just to show off, but to create spaces where their rituals could be performed for eternity, keeping their memory and therefore their But even those temples needed staff, funding, maintenance, and security, which meant more rituals, more administration, more anxiety. You were a divine figure caught in a loop of symbolic chores, and no matter how many ceremonies you completed, there were always more. The gods didn't care if you were tired. They didn't care if you'd been up since 4 a.m. They didn't care that you were sweating through your 5th layer of linen in 45-degree heat. They wanted their incense, their hymns, their polished altars, and their dancing girls, and they wanted them now. So you did it. Because if you didn't, the crops would fail, the Nile would dry, and everyone would blame you. You weren't just a pharaoh. You were the full-time assistant manager of a supernatural bureaucracy that never closed, never took breaks, and never accepted excuses. So maybe you're thinking, alright, being pharaoh sounds awful, but what about being a regular person in ancient Egypt? Surely life was simpler when you weren't wrapped in gold or burdened by rituals. Surely the peasants had it easier. And to that we say, absolutely not. If being a pharaoh was a nightmare of cosmic responsibility and paranoia, then being a commoner was just a night. Let's start with farmers. Egypt was, famously, the breadbasket of the ancient world. But that bread came at a cost. Most of the population were agricultural laborers whose lives revolved entirely around the weather it decided to flood properly. A good flood meant the fields were nourished, crops grew, people ate. A weak flood meant famine. A strong flood meant your house got washed away. And if the flood didn't come at all, you were dead. And you didn't even get to blame the river. You blamed the pharaoh. The flooding cycle was everything. People worked according to its rhythms. But the flood season also meant no farming. So guess what happened then? You got drafted into public service projects, by which we mean being forced to haul bricks for temples, dredge irrigation canals, or maybe help build that shiny new tomb for the pharaoh who detaxed your village into oblivion. There was no opting out. If you refused, you risked punishment. And not just a fine. We're talking beatings, imprisonment, or having your land taken. Most peasants lived in small mud brick homes, often shared with animals, full of dust, smoke, and bugs. There was no plumbing, there was no privacy, and there was definitely no escape from the heat. Daily life meant hours under the sun, working the soil with wooden tools, all while praying the granaries wouldn't be raided by corrupt officials or eaten by rats. Oh, and speaking of officials, tax collectors were relentless. Everything was taxed. Grained livestock, beer, oil, honey, even fishing. If you couldn't pay in goods, they took it in labor. And if you still couldn't pay, then you probably found yourself shackled to a work gang, breaking rocks or digging canals somewhere very far from home. And yet somehow, the scribes had it worse. You might think being a scribe was a cushy government job, indoors, literate, no manual labor. But scribes were basically human printers. You copied the same legal texts, religious hymns, or bureaucratic forms for hours on end, every day, using reeds dipped in ink, made from soot and crushed plants, paper that was papyrus, rough, fibrous, and brittle. You couldn't just cross something out. If you ruined a scroll, you could be fined or punished. Your back hurt from hunching, your eyes ached from squinting, your fingers cramped from gripping the same tool endlessly. There were no chairs with lumbar support. There were no breaks unless your supervisor was in a good mood, and he usually wasn't. And while scribes were educated, they weren't exactly powerful. Most worked for temples or local governors, meaning they were caught in the middle of the food chain, smarter than the peasants, but just as expendable to the elite. If a shipment of grain disappeared or a tax report was late, the scribe got blamed. If a curse went unrecorded or an offering list was out of order, the scribe got punished. And the worst job, being an mummification, sounds fascinating until you realize it involves spending hours alone in a dark, hot room with a decomposing body and a jar of resin. Embalmers weren't hated, but they weren't exactly loved either. Most Egyptians were terrified of death and didn't want to be near dead bodies, even if they were royal. So embalmers were considered necessary but a little cursed. The process itself was grotesque. You had to remove the brain through the nose using a hooked tool. Then you cut open the side of the body, pulled out the organs, dried them with and stuffed the body with resin-soaked linens, all while fighting off flies, breathing in chemicals, and hoping the family didn't suddenly accuse you of botching the ritual. If the mummification went wrong, the soul could get lost in the afterlife. And guess whose fault that was? Yours. But at least embalmers had skills. Most people just worked themselves to death. Literally, life expectancy was low, especially for the poor. Many Egyptians didn't live past 35. Childhood diseases, infections, injuries, parasites, any of them could kill you. If you broke a leg, you were done. If you had a bad tooth, it could abscess and kill you. If you were unlucky enough to be born during a bad flood year, you probably starved. And death didn't mean rest. Funerals were expensive. If your family couldn't afford proper rituals, you might not make it to the afterlife. That meant wandering forever as a hungry ghost cursed to haunt the living or just rot in the do-it. So even in death, the poor got second-class treatment. Sure, a few people rose through the rank: smart scribes, skilled artisans, lucky merchants, but most were trapped in an unchanging cycle of work, tax, drought, disease, and ritual. You worshipped gods who never answered, paid tribute to rulers who never saw you, and prayed for floods that might destroy your home or save your village. And you did it all with a smile, because complaining in ancient Egypt wasn't safe. There was no protest, no democracy, no freedom of speech. If you openly criticized the government, the priesthood, or the pharaoh, you could be punished, banished, or quietly disappeared. Your only option was to write a sarcastic poem and hope someone found it 1,000 years later carved into a rock wall. So no, life as a regular person wasn't easier. It was sunburn, back pain, constant hunger, and bureaucratic fear, all wrapped in sand and silence. You weren't building pyramids, you were buried beneath them. So far, we've talked about pharaohs, peasants, scribes, and the general misery of living in ancient Egypt. But what about the soldiers? Surely marching around with bronze weapons, shouting in formation, and looking cool in wall paintings was at least a little bit glorious, right? Not exactly. Being a soldier in ancient Egypt was less about glory and more about heatstroke infections, long march, and the constant risk of dying in a ditch far from home, while your superiors chiseled a very generous version of events onto a temple wall. Let's begin with the basics. The Egyptian army wasn't made up of professional career soldiers. Most of the time it was conscripts, regular men, often farmers, called up to serve for a campaign and then sent back to their fields when it was over. That meant most soldiers had almost no training, little experience, and only a vague idea of what they were doing. Their equipment was equally unimpressive. Maybe a wooden spear, a leather shield, and if you were lucky, a bronze dagger. Armor, not really. Maybe some padded cloth. Or if you were elite, a scaled cuirass made of metal plates sewn to leather. But those were heavy, expensive, and rare. Most men fought in sandals, loincloths, and the sheer hope that Ra was watching. Marching through the desert was brutal. Egypt's military campaigns often took them far south into Nubia or north into the Levant, which meant days or weeks of trekking under the sun, with limited water, bad rations, and the constant threat of ambush. Soldiers carried their own supplies: water skins, dried bread, perhaps onions, or dried fish, and if they ran out, that was too bad. Logistics in ancient warfare were rudimentary, so if the supply line failed, you were expected to live off the land, which usually meant raiding villages, stealing food, and making a lot of enemies along the way. Combat was terrifying. There were no rules of engagement, no formal duels, no mercy. Battlefields were chaotic messes of dust, blood, and shouting. Arrows flew at random. Chariots ran people over. Men were stabbed, crushed, or trampled, and medical care, primitive, doesn't even begin to cover it. If you were wounded, a scribe might write a prayer for you, and a healer would slap some honey and moldy bread on the wound. That was it. If the bleeding didn't stop or the wound got infected, you died. Slowly, in pain, and probably alone. If you were captured, your chances weren't much better. Egyptian prisoners were often executed, enslaved, or blinded, and when Egypt took prisoners, they often did the same. Victory was measured in body parts. Soldiers would cut off the hands or genitals of enemy corpses to count kills. These were piled in front of commanders, sometimes even before the pharaoh himself, who would nod solemnly while someone took notes on a papyrus scroll. Back home, military victories were exaggerated in official inscriptions. Pharaohs would describe themselves as defeating tens of thousands of enemies single-handedly, standing firm as the chaos of war swirled around them. In reality, they were usually safe behind the lines, protected by elite bodyguards, while conscripts did the dying. And if you happened to survive, congratulations. You got to go back to your village with a limp and some vague praise. Maybe you'd be rewarded with a new loincloth, or a ceremonial dagger you weren't allowed to use. Maybe your name would be carved onto a wall somewhere, misspelled, but more likely, no one remembered your service at all. Unless, of course, you had the misfortune of being in a garrison. These were stationed along Egypt's borders or in newly conquered territories. The work wasn't glamorous. You sat in a dusty outpost, watched the same horizon for months on end, fought off the occasional raid, and tried not to die of boredom, dysentery, or sunstroke. If there wasn't, you were just slowly forgotten. The higher ranks didn't have it much better. Officers had to balance military command with religious protocol, which meant making offerings, observing omens, and sometimes delaying action because someone saw a bad bird. Generals were expected to bring back loot, prisoners, and glory for the Pharaoh, but if they failed, they could be executed, demoted, or forced to build their own tomb early. Even success was dangerous. If you won too many battles or got too popular, the Pharaoh might start to see you as a threat. After all, Egypt had seen ambitious generals become kings before. Better to eliminate a rising star early than deal with a coup later. And then there were the chariot crews. These were considered elite forces, fast, deadly, mobile, but driving a chariot at full speed across uneven terrain while trying to shoot arrows accurately with a composite bow was, frankly, insane. One wrong turn, and you flipped into a ditch. One snapped axle, and you were done. Chariot teams required coordination, strength, and nerves of steel. And even then, you were one flaming javelin away from becoming a crispy footnote in someone else's victory scroll. And what about foreign mercenaries? Egypt used them often. Nubians, Libyans, Syrians, even sea peoples. They were paid better, sometimes treated better, but still very expendable. They were often given the most dangerous assignments, sent in first, and blamed when things went wrong. If they survived, they might be given land. If they didn't, well, there were always more where they came from. Being a soldier in Egypt wasn't about patriotism or honor, it's about survival. And most of the time it barely offered that. You were a tool of the state, used when needed, discarded when not. Your family might receive a small offering from the local temple if you died in service, but that was about it. Your name was rarely remembered, your sacrifice rarely honored. And if you complained, your superior officer could beat you, imprison you, or have you assigned to latrine duty until you learned your lesson. So no, there was nothing glorious about ancient Egyptian warfare. It was hot, dirty, brutal, and often pointless. The Pharaoh got a statue, got a scar, maybe if you were lucky, and if not, you became one more unmarked grave in the sand. You'd think that with all the gods Egypt had, they'd be a little more helpful. But no. Ancient Egypt had over 1,500 named deities, and not one of them made life any easier. In fact, most of them made it worse. Because Egyptian religion wasn't about comfort, it was about anxiety, obligation, and the constant fear that if you forgot to light a lamp on the right day, the sun might not rise tomorrow. At the top of the celestial bureaucracy was Ra, the sun god, who sailed across the sky by day and battled monsters in the underworld by night. Every single night, if he lost, the sun wouldn't come up. So naturally, Egyptians performed daily rituals to help him win, lighting incense, chanting hymns, offering bread, and pretending they had any influence over a divine solar war happening in another dimension. But Ra wasn't alone. There was Osiris, Lord of the Dead, who'd been chopped into pieces and reassembled by his wife's sister Isis, which was weird. There was Set, the god of chaos, storms, and being generally terrible. There was Thoth, who had the head of an ibis and invented writing, but still expected you to copy his spells perfectly or risk eternal confusion in the afterlife. There was Bastet, a goddess who protected households, but could also turn into a terrifying lioness if she felt like it. Sobek was a crocodile who liked rivers and also human flesh. Hathor loved music, but could transform into Set, a lion goddess who once killed so many people that the gods had to get her drunk just to make her stop. And these were just the major players. Every town had its own version of the gods. Every temple had local customs, favorite offerings, specific calendar days, and regional festivals. If you moved from one city to another, your old religious routine might become useless or even offensive. Forget to bring an offering to the crocodile god in his hometown. He might eat your crops, or your children, or you. Religion wasn't a source of peace. It was a full-time job, and no one was exempt. Pharaohs had to participate in major rituals to maintain had cosmic balance, but ordinary people were responsible for everything else. That meant keeping your household shrine clean, giving offerings to the right gods on the right days, not offending spirits, and generally behaving in ways that wouldn't attract divine punishment. But the rules were inconsistent. The gods were moody. You could do everything right and still have a bad harvest. Your child could get sick, your boat could sink. And what explanation did the priests give you? The gods are mysterious. In other words, don't ask questions. Just keep sacrificing goats and hope next year's flood doesn't kill you. And yes, sacrifices were a big deal. Not human ones, at least. Not usually, but animals, food, incense, drink, statues, symbolic items. If you were poor, you offered bread. If you were rich, you offered oxen. If you were pharaoh, you were expected to build entire temples, hire permanent priesthoods, and throw festivals so elaborate they made your treasury cry. The temples were enormous stone complexes filled with sacred rooms, restricted zones, and guards who would absolutely arrest you if you wandered into the wrong hallway. Most Egyptians never even entered the inner sanctums of the gods. Only priests could go in, and they had to purify themselves daily, shaving all body hair, bathing several times, wearing special linen, and eating certain foods. Being a priest wasn't a hobby. It was an exhausting commitment to a god who might reward you with dreams or nightmares. And the gods weren't just worshipped, they were feared. They caused disease. They cursed tomb robbers. They judged souls in the afterlife with scales and crocodile demons. They could appear in dreams, possess animals, send omens, or turn your children into frogs if you looked at them wrong. And since there were so many of them, and their roles overlapped, it was hard to know which one to pray to. Is your child sick because of Set? Or is it Bastet punishing you for yelling at a cat? Did Sobek flood your basement? Or is that just bad architecture? The line between theology and superstition was razor thin, and most people weren't confident they were doing it right. Which brings us to magic known as Heck. It wasn't optional. It was how you survived. People wore amulets, recited protective spells, hired magicians, and used charms to keep spirits away. Everything from childbirth to fishing had magical protocols. If your cow wouldn't give milk, there was a spell for that. If your house fell off, there were incantations to banish ghosts. Even pharaohs had magicians in court, not because they liked entertainment, but because they were afraid of being cursed by rivals or haunted by enemies. And let's not forget the afterlife, because dying in Egypt was just the beginning of a long, terrifying journey through the Duata shadowy underworld filled with monsters, traps, and judgment. Your heart would be weighed against the feather of Mat. If it was heavier because of sin, lies, or just general bad vibes, it would be eaten by Amata demon with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the backside of a hippo, gone forever. No second chances. To avoid that fate, you needed to be buried with the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and passwords to help navigate the underworld. But scrolls were expansive, so were coffins, so was mummification. If you couldn't afford the full package, your odds of surviving the afterlife were slim. And if you died without descendants to honor you, no one would perform the rituals to keep your soul fed. You'd fade, hungry, alone, forgotten. The horror wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. To the ancient Egyptians, spiritual extinction was worse than death, and the only defense against it was obsessive, lifelong devotion to gods who might ignore you anyway. So no, the religion didn't help. It terrified everyone equally. It was a system designed to enforce order through fear, powered by mystery, and sustained by ritual. It consumed your time, your resources, your sanity. And if you slipped up even once, you might find yourself being judged by a crocodile in the afterlife because you forgot to offer onions during the Feast of Hathor. Welcome to Egyptian religion. Come for the eternal life. Stay for the constant anxiety. Let's talk about architecture. More specifically, the kind that ruins your back, drains your treasury, and takes 20 years to finish so that you can lie inside it for eternity, while nobody remembers your name. Because if you were a pharaoh, your real job wasn't ruling, or leading armies, or even feeding the gods. Your real job was building things. Temples, monuments, tombs, obelisks, giant stone messages to the future that said, "I'm mattered. Please don't forget me." The logic was simple. In ancient Egypt, to be remembered was to live forever. But building those monuments, that was hell. Start with the logistics. Stone wasn't just lying around near every construction site. Limestone had to be quarried. Granite came from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers of river. Sandstone came from the desert. Every block had to be carved by hand using bronze chisels that dulled constantly, then transported by river, if you were lucky, or dragged across the desert on wooden sleds lubricated with water in sheer despair. Thousands of workers were required. Artisans, laborers, overseers, cooks, priests, engineers, guards, scribes. Housing them meant building temporary villages. Feeding them meant draining local food stores. Supervising them meant appointing officials who might be corrupt, lazy, or secretly trying to take credit for your building project when you died early. And pharaohs often did die early, which meant your masterpiece tomb was left unfinished. That's why so many royal tombs, including those in the Valley of the Kings, just ... stop. Long corridors that lead to nowhere. Decorative carvings that end in the final room carved in a rush because the king dropped dead before they could make the ceiling symmetrical. And these tombs weren't designed for comfort. They were underground, dark, and filled with traps, mostly symbolic, but sometimes very real. False doors, hidden shafts, deadened corridors. Why? To keep out tomb robbers, which didn't work. Almost every tomb in Egypt was looted, including the big ones. Even the Great Pyramid of Giza, that massive pile of ego built by Khufu, was cracked open by looters long before modern archaeologists showed up. And the valuables, gone. The gold, the jewels, the fancy grave goods, all stripped, melted, sold, or hidden in someone's cousin's donkey cart. The pharaoh got eternal rest. The thieves got rich, except when they didn't. Tomb robbery was a capital offense. If you were caught, you were tortured, interrogated, and often executed. But people still did it, because tombs were full of unimaginable wealth and regular Egyptians lived in unimaginable poverty. The risk was worth it, and sometimes the officials guarding the tombs were in on it. They'd investigate a robbery, write a report, and quietly take a cut. Some even staged break-ins to cover up their own thefts. It got so bad that later pharaohs stopped burying themselves in pyramids altogether and started hiding their tombs in remote valleys. Still didn't help. The problem wasn't location, it was value. If you put a mountain of gold under a few tons of stone, someone's going to dig for it. But let's not forget the workers who built these things. We're not talking about slaves here. That's a myth. Most tomb builders were skilled laborers who worked on rotation, fed by the state, and housed in organized camps. But that doesn't mean they had it easy. The hours were long, the tools were basic, and the health risks were real. Skeletons from Dia el Medina, the village of tomb workers, show signs of arthritis, malnutrition, and crushed bones. And when their wages were delayed, they went on strike. One of the earliest recorded labor strikes in history came from Egyptian tomb workers, who were tired of not being paid in beer and bread. They walked off the job, sat down in the temple, and refused to keep building, which is kind of amazing. But it didn't stop pharaohs from demanding bigger tombs. Each new king wanted to outdo the last. Higher walls, deeper chambers, more inscriptions. Some built entire cities near their tombs just to support the workers. Some diverted the Nile to float stones into the desert, or so they could lie under a painted ceiling, while future generations walked past their broken sarcophagus without reading the cartouche. Even the art was demanding. Reliefs had to follow strict style rules. Side profile faces, forward-facing torsos 1 foot forward, every figure the same size unless they were important, every glyph drawn in a sacred order. Artists didn't get to be creative, they were human photocopiers for the divine, and mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they were dangerous. If a scribe carved the pharaoh's name wrong, that could doom his soul in the afterlife. You could be punished for it, or killed, so people double-checked, and then still got it wrong sometimes, because carving into granite with a bronze chisel is hard, especially in the dark, especially when your boss is screaming about divine punishment and the work crew is 20 days behind schedule. And then there were obelisks, giant stone needles weighing hundreds of tons, quarried in one piece, carved with divine inscriptions, floated down the Nile, and erected with ropes, sand, and physics that no one really understands today, all to point to the sky and say, "Look, Ra, I did a thing. Please don't destroy the kingdom." And if one broke in transit, disaster, it meant omens, shame, maybe even revolt. You'd have to start over. And by you, we mean thousands of workers who would now spend another 2 years hauling another rock out of a quarry while dodging scorpions and sunstroke. So yes, ancient Egypt left behind incredible monuments, but those monuments were paid for in blood, sweat, broken bones, and forgotten names. The pharaoh got credit, everyone else got dust. And for what? So that your corpse could lie in a stone box surrounded by broken furniture and rats. So that your soul could enjoy the afterlife, while your tomb filled with bats. So that tourists in the 21st century could take selfies next to your half-raised face and say, "Wow, cool pyramid. Welcome to Egyptian architecture." It lasts forever, and so does the suffering it took to build it. Let's shift focus a bit from pyramids and politics to something far more personal. Family life. You'd think that being pharaoh or even a high-ranking elite meant you got to enjoy a peaceful domestic life with a loving spouse, obedient children, and maybe a golden cat or two lounging in the courtyard. Not even close. In ancient Egypt, family was less about emotional support and more about succession, property, and the delicate art of making sure your own relatives didn't kill you in your sleep to claim the throne. Let's start with royal marriage. Pharaohs didn't marry for love. They married for bloodline purity, political alliances, and sometimes just because the priests told them to. That's why so many pharaohs married their own sisters, or half-sisters, or daughters, because keeping the bloodline divine meant keeping it disturbingly close. Did anyone enjoy this arrangement? Probably not, but it was tradition, and tradition mattered more than comfort. So he ended up with royal couples who were technically husband and wife, and also siblings, and who still had to smile for temple carvings while pretending this wasn't extremely weird. But incest wasn't the only complication. Pharaoh's Khadand often did have multiple wives. The main wife was the great royal wife, the one whose children had the best claim to the throne. But the king also had secondary wives, harem women, and probably several unofficial concubines who weren't recorded in public inscriptions, which meant royal palaces were filled with rival factions. Wives competing for influence, children plotting against half-siblings, and mothers scheming to get their sons recognized as the next ruler. The palace wasn't a home, it was a political battlefield. And if you were born into it, congratulations. Your childhood was now a long audition for power. You learned etiquette, ritual recitation, and how to smile while everyone around you plotted your downfall. Even outside royalty, family life wasn't simple. Marriage contracts were legal documents that included lists of possessions, divorce conditions, and inheritance rights. Yes, Divorce was possible in ancient Egypt and surprisingly common. A woman could initiate it, especially if the man failed to provide or was violent. But once separated, social status often plummeted, and custody battles could get ugly. And speaking of women, Egyptian women had more rights than in many ancient societies. They could own property, manage businesses, testify in court, and pass inheritance to their children. Sounds great, right? Until you remember that all of this depended on class, location, and the whims of the men around them. A wealthy priest's wife might have real authority. A poor farmer's wife might just have back pain, 7 kids, and a life expectancy of 30. Children were everywhere. Families were large because child mortality was high. Most didn't survive past age 5. Those who did were put to work early. Boys learned trades from their fathers. Girls helped in the home, married in their teens, and started producing babies as soon as biologically possible. Childhood wasn't protected, it was something to survive. And if you were born into a noble family, your freedom wasn't much better. You were expected to live according to status. Your clothing, behavior, speech, marriage, all predetermined. You were a walking representation of your family's reputation. If you stepped out of line, you could bring shame to your entire lineage. Punishment wasn't always corporal. It was often economic or spiritual. You might be disinherited, cursed, or simply written out of the family tomb. And in a culture obsessed with the afterlife, that was worse than death. Family disputes didn't stop with the living. Even dead relatives could cause problems. If someone didn't perform the proper funerary rites, the deceased might become a restless spirit wandering the earth, causing misfortune, and generally making life miserable. Letters to the dead were a real thing. People wrote messages begging their deceased relatives to stop haunting them, promising to fix whatever mistake had offended them in the first place. Sorry, we forgot the offering last month. Uncle Horn, please stop ruining our crops. Meanwhile, elderly parents often lived with their adult children. There were no nursing homes. Taking care of your elders was both a duty and a risk, because if you failed to do it properly, they might curse you literally. There are records of parents threatening their children with magical retaliation if they were mistreated. Family love, but with spiritual blackmail. Even inheritance wasn't simple. Property was divided among children, but the eldest son usually got the biggest share. That created resentment. Siblings feuded, legal cases dragged on for years. And if you were a woman trying to claim your share, good luck, you'd better have documentation, witnesses, and divine patience. Because ancient Egyptian courts were slow, corrupt, and deeply patriarchal. But let's go back to the palace, because family drama reached its peak at the top. Pharaohs were supposed to be gods on earth, but they were also human. They got old, they got sick, they made mistakes. And when succession was unclear, chaos followed. Egypt had civil wars, assassinations, and entire dynasties wiped out by ambitious relatives. One prince might poison his brother. A queen might install her child as ruler, then rule through him. A half-Khazan might forge a royal decree and declare himself king. And once power changed hands, the new ruler often erased the names of his rivals from monuments, like they never existed. Because to erase someone's name in Egypt was to erase their soul. That's how you killed someone twice. Even the mighty Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried to overthrow the entire Egyptian religion, was so despised after his death that later rulers chiseled out his name, defaced his statues, and buried his legacy under more traditional temples. Family wasn't just complicated, it was dangerous. A single misstep could cost you your throne, your life, or your soul. And yet you couldn't escape it. Whether you were a peasant or a king, your identity was defined by your family or lineage, your obligations, your inherited guilt. You owed your parents obedience, your children protection, your spouse fidelity, your ancestors remembrance. And if you failed any of them, there were consequences, social, legal, spiritual. So next time you think about royal families as glamorous, dynasties full of jewels and wine goblets, remember this. Behind every golden mask was a family feud waiting to happen, a political conspiracy in progress, and a teenager wondering if he could poison his uncle without getting caught by the gods. Welcome to Egyptian family life. It built empires. It destroyed them too. By now you may be wondering, was there any part of life in ancient Egypt that wasn't terrible? Maybe music, maybe food. Surely people danced and had festivals and occasionally laughed under the stars. And yes, they did. But even fun in ancient Egypt came with its own set of problems, protocols, and potential for getting cursed by accident. Let's start with food. Egypt had fertile land along the Nile, and its people grew wheat, barley, onions, garlic, dates, figs, and lettuce. Not the fluffy bread and filtered beer. Tada bread in ancient Egypt was coarse, full of sand, and so dense it wore down people's teeth by the time they were 20. And beer wasn't alcoholic fun in a bottle. It was more like fermented porridge with chunks. Everyone drank it, including children, because the water wasn't always safe. Wealthy Egyptians had more variety. Beef, fish, duck, pomegranates, honey, and wine if you were really fancy. But food storage was primitive. Spoilage was common. Flies were everywhere. And if you didn't pray to the right gods before a harvest, you might not have a harvest. And if you didn't have a harvest, no festival. Speaking of which, Egypt had a lot of festivals. Nearly every god had one. Some lasted a day, others lasted weeks. There was music, dancing, drinking, feasting, and processions of sacred statues carried through town on sleds. While priests chanted and musicians played harps, flutes, and sistrums, metal rattles used to drive away evil spirits or just annoy your neighbors. Everyone participated. Peasants, nobles, priests, even the pharaoh, if it was a big enough festival. On the surface it sounds great. A break from work, some excitement, maybe a chance to drink a little too much date wine and yell poetry at a goat. But festivals were also religious obligations. You couldn't skip them, and you couldn't misbehave, at least not too much, because the line between celebration and blasphemy was thin. If you laughed too loudly during a solemn procession, the gods might get offended. If you showed up without a proper offering, your ancestors might haunt you. And if you passed out drunk in the wrong temple courtyard, well, you'd probably wake up shaved and sentenced to clean up after sacred cats for a month. Even dancing was risky. Some dances were sacred, performed by trained temple dancers with specific movements and approved costumes. If a regular person tried to copy them at home for fun and messed up the gestures, they might be accused of mocking the gods, which, again, could lead to a curse. So fun was allowed, but only if you followed the rules. And there were a lot of rules. Then there was entertainment, storytelling, games, board games like Cnot, which was part recreation and part symbolic preparation for the afterlife. Yes, that's right, your version of Monopoly was a religious metaphor. If you lost at Cnot, maybe your soul would too. No pressure hunting was another pastime for the wealthy. Hippo hunting especially was considered brave and symbolic. The hippo represented chaos, and killing one was like defending Mat itself. But hippos are huge, fast, and aggressive. So every time you went on a boat with a spear and some friends, there was a real chance the hippo would capsize your boat, stomp on your cousin, and ruin your weekend. Sports, sure, wrestling, swimming, boat racing, archery. But again, everything had symbolic meaning. You couldn't just win a race, you had to dedicate it to a god, make a proper offering, and not boast too loudly afterward, or someone might accuse you of hubris and report you to a priest. Parties, only for the elite. They had banquets with music, servants pouring wine, perfumed cones, worn on the head, and imported delicacies. But these weren't wild celebrations, they were structured. Guests sat in specific orders. Topics of conversation were limited, and someone was always watching. If you said the wrong thing or laughed at the wrong joke, you could be accused of disrespecting the host or worse, mocking tradition. That could cost you your job, your land, or your life. So fun, yes. But stressful fun. Structured fun. The kind of fun where you need to consult a lunar calendar, wear the right color linen, and chant a quick apology to Thoth before every game night. Even love wasn't safe. Romantic poetry existed. Love songs, flirtations, even little love charms. But marriage wasn't about romance, it was about alliances, property, inheritance. And while premarital sex wasn't taboo, children born outside of formal marriage complicated inheritance laws. So people either hid their love lives or paid scribes to draw up very precise contracts explaining who got what, if the relationship didn't survive the next plague. And let's not forget dreams. In most cultures, dreams are weird stories your brain tells itself. In ancient Egypt, dreams were real. They were divine messages, or warnings, or visits from the dead. That meant if you had a bad dream, you didn't just forget it. You visited a dream interpreter, offered a sacrifice, maybe slept in a temple to receive a healing dream that would undo the bad one. You couldn't even relax while unconscious. So yes, Egyptians laughed, they sang, they danced, they held hands under the stars and ate figs by the Nile. But joy was never free, it always came with instructions. Joy was ritualized, supervised, regulated by gods, priests, calendars, and the ever-present threat of spiritual consequences. Even fun was a responsibility, which is perhaps the best summary of ancient Egyptian life in general. No matter who you were, no matter what you were doing, someone somewhere, living or dead, expected you to do it correctly, or else. Now let's talk about medicine, or more accurately, how being sick in ancient Egypt meant you were about to become very familiar with onions, crocodile dung, magic spells, and probably death. Ancient Egypt had one of the most advanced medical systems in the ancient world, and it was still terrifying. Doctors existed. Some were trained professionals. There were even medical papyri, like the Edwin Smith papyrus and the Ebers papyrus, filled with diagnoses, treatments, and anatomical observations. But the problem was, Egyptian medicine didn't distinguish much between science and magic. To the ancient Egyptians, disease was often caused by evil spirits, angry gods, or a disruption in cosmic balance. So a typical treatment for a stomachache might include eating crushed herbs, reciting a spell, wearing an amulet, and smearing lizard fat on your belly while facing west and yelling the name of a protective deity. And if that didn't work, you tried crocodile dung. That's not a joke, it was a common ingredient in treatments. Also included in prescriptions: moldy bread, fermented dough, pig's teeth, and the milk of a woman who had given birth to a male child. These remedies weren't optional. They were believed to work because medicine wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The body, the soul, and the universe were all connected, which meant healing your liver also meant realigning your cosmic resonance and apologizing to whatever god you had accidentally offended while sneezing last week. Surgery was extremely limited, setting broken bones, sometimes lancing abscesses, maybe, but there was no anesthetic beyond beer and hope, no antibiotics, no real understanding of infection. If you survived a major injury, it was because your immune system was stronger than everyone else. It's not because your doctor had a breakthrough in antiseptic procedure. And yet doctors had high status. They were respected, often connected to temples, and sometimes attached to royal households. But if a treatment failed, the patient's family might accuse the physician of incompetence or sacrilege. In some cases, this led to punishment. You weren't just a healer, you were a gambler playing dice with gods, and the dice were rigged. Women had specialized doctors for childbirth because, surprise, childbirth was incredibly dangerous. Maternal mortality was high. So was infant mortality. Midwives relied on experience, herbal knowledge, and ritual chants to get the baby out safely. But if something went wrong, if the baby didn't cry or the mother bled too much, people assumed a curse was involved, or maybe a ghost, or maybe Bastet was angry, in which case the midwife was now in trouble. Children, when they survived, got sick constantly. Parasites were common. So were infections, fevers, and mysterious diseases that modern doctors still don't understand. Toothaches could kill you. A minor wound could become septic. And your treatment, crushed garlic, honey, and probably another spell. And if you couldn't afford a doctor, you went to a temple healer or just hoped your aunt knew the right prayer. But even if you did everything right, ate clean food, gave offerings, avoided cursed objects, you could still get sick. And when you did, your only real hope was rest and luck. There were no hospitals, no organized public health care. Priests might help you, but only if you were pious and polite. And if the illness was clearly magical in origin, they might decide it was your fault. Maybe you insulted a god. Maybe your ancestors were angry. Maybe a neighbor cursed you because you let your goats trample her onion. The solution: more spells, more amulets, more visits to sacred crocodiles who may or may not have healing powers, depending on how they were feeling that day. And this blurred line between medicine and magic meant that quacks were everywhere. Anyone could claim to be a healer. Maybe they learned from a temple. Maybe they just inherited a box of old recipes. Maybe they wore the right amulet. You couldn't be sure. But once they started chanting and blowing incense on your chest while painting your toenails with goat blood, it was kinda too late to back out. And then there were plagues. When disease spread across villages, people panicked. Not because they understood germs, but because they thought the gods were angry. Plague could mean a failed ritual, or a foreign curse, or maybe a dead pharaoh had been buried properly and was now unleashing chaos from the afterlife. So what did people do? Mass rituals, sacrifices, pilgrimages, anything to convince the divine realm to stop melting their eyeballs. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes everyone just died. Even pharaohs weren't immune. Mummies show signs of arthritis, tooth decay, malaria, tuberculosis. Royal doctors did what they could. But when the king got sick, it was political. Priests got involved. Temples performed rituals. And if the pharaoh died anyway, everyone scrambled to prove that his death had meaning. Maybe it was cosmic. Maybe it was necessary. Maybe the afterlife just had an urgent vacancy. In truth, death was everywhere, and medicine couldn't stop it. It could only delay it badly and with crocodile dung. So while Egyptian medicine was ahead of its time in some ways, it was also terrifying, confusing, and often deadly. It relied on trial and error, faith and fear, and a healthy dose of guessing. If you got better, it was a miracle. If you got worse, it was your fault. You didn't pray hard enough. You didn't chant the spell right. You let your amulet touch the ground. You sneezed while looking at a babu. Anything could tip the balance, which meant every illness was a moral crisis, every cure a cosmic negotiation, and every recovery a temporary victory in a world where your body, your soul, and your luck were in constant danger. Welcome to Egyptian healthcare. We regret to inform you it's terminal. Let's talk about the Nile, the glorious, life-giving Nile, the river that turned a narrow strip of desert into one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. It flooded regularly, gave fertile soil, transported goods, and provided fish, papyrus, drinking water, and transportation. Without the Nile, there was no Egypt. But also, without the Nile, there was no constant flooding, no crocodile attacks, no waterborne diseases, and far fewer drownings. Because while the Nile was a blessing, it also kinda sucked. First of all, the floods. Every year, the river overflowed its banks in what was supposed to be a predictable, gentle inundation that watered the fields, renewed the soil, and marked the beginning of the agricultural season. But nature doesn't always follow the script. Sometimes the floods came late, or too early, or didn't come at all. In those years, crops failed, people starved, entire regions panicked, and sometimes the Nile flooded to marsh, destroying homes, washing away villages and drowning people, livestock, and temples. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. The entire economy depended on a stable flood. Priests were expected to predict it using astronomy and omens. If they got it wrong, everyone blamed them. And if people got angry enough, they might riot, or worse, stop giving offerings to the temples. But the Nile wasn't just dangerous because of water. It was also dangerous because of what lived in it. Crocodiles, for example. Big ones. Aggressive ones. Sometimes considered sacred, but usually considered a really fast way to get your leg bitten off. If you lived near the river, you knew to be careful. Don't fish alone. Don't bathe at dusk. Don't carry meat near the shore. And if you did get attacked, there wasn't much anyone could do, except maybe pray to Sobek the crocodile, god who sometimes protected people from crocodiles, but also was a crocodile. So his help wasn't guaranteed. And then there were hippos. They might look cute in hieroglyphs, but they were enormous, territorial beasts that hated boats, people, and basically anything that moved near their water. They could overturn a boat, crush a man, and swim faster than anyone expected. Pharaohs hunted them to show off their bravery, but regular people just tried not to get noticed. The Nile also brought disease, still water-bred parasites. Schistomius was common, caused by tiny worms that enter your body through the skin and damage your organs. Yay! And if the flood waters mixed with sewage or dead animals, even more infections. People got fevers, rashes, boils, stomach cramps, and no, ancient Egyptian medicine could not help. It just gave you garlic and a hymn. And yet, people still depended on the Nile for everything. It was the main highway. Boats transported grain, stone, officials, soldiers, mummies. You didn't travel by land unless you had to. The river was faster, smoother, and less likely to involve jackals. But boat travel came with risks. Boats capsized. Boats were attacked by river pirates. Boats were stopped by corrupt toll collectors who demanded bribes in the name of Pharaoh. If your cargo went missing, you were blamed. If your boat broke down, you were stranded. And in the summer, the heat made everything worse. The water stank. The fish died. The river receded into smelly mud full of insects, mosquitoes, flies, biting things that laid eggs in your skin. And when the river dried too far, the canals cracked. The irrigation failed. Farmers sat around looking at their dead fields and wondering which god they'd offended this time. And of course, the Nile was sacred. It was personified as the god Hapi, a fertile, generous, round-bellied figure who brought blessings in abundance. So you couldn't complain about the river. You had to praise it, offer to it, sing songs about it. And when it destroyed your village, you said, "Praise Hapi, may his blessings return soon." Or else, because if you said the wrong thing about the Nile, you were basically insulting a god. And the last thing you needed was for Hapi to take that personally. There were also practical problems. Flood season made roads impassable. Trade routes shut down, labor crews couldn't move. And while some people used the flood season as a break, others used it to collect taxes, because the state knew exactly how much land you owned and how much it should produce. If it didn't produce enough, tough luck, you still owed the full amount. And if you couldn't pay in grain, you paid in labor, or livestock, or children, which meant that when the Nile failed, the tax system squeezed harder. And when it succeeded, the elites took credit. So the river that sustained you also punished you. It gave life and took it away. It was worshipped and feared. It brought bread and crocodiles, joy and infection, festivals and funerals. You couldn't escape it. You lived by it, you died by it, and you were probably buried not far from it to your tomb, oriented carefully to catch the first light of the sun rising over the water that gave your people everything and took nearly as much in return. The Nile was a miracle, a deadly, unpredictable, divine, disease-ridden miracle. And like everything else in ancient Egypt, you respected it because you had no choice. Welcome to life beside the sacred river. Don't forget your offering, and maybe keep an eye out for hippos. At this point, it's fair to ask, was there any escape? Any chance for an ancient Egyptian to leave the crushing obligations of religion, monarchy, family, nature, and crocodile-infested rivers behind and just disappear? Actually, yes, you could die. And then you could go to the afterlife. Except that also kind of sucked. See, the Egyptians didn't imagine death as an ending. It was a continuation, a very bureaucratic continuation. You didn't just drop dead and float into paradise. First, you had to be properly mummified, properly buried, properly mourned, and properly remembered. If any part of that process failed, your soul might get stuck, or confused, or eaten. Let's start with the body. Mummification was essential because the body had to be preserved as a vessel for your soul. The Kaaba and Osier, which were all different spiritual components that did different things and needed to be in communication with each other, your family, and the gods. This required professional embalmers, resins, linen, amulets, spells, and lots of natural and unnatural salt used to dry out the corpse over several weeks. The process involved removing your internal organous except of heart, which was needed for judge and placing the organs in canopic jars, drying the body, anointing it, wrapping it, and placing it in one or more coffins. Then, Ideally, your mummy was sealed in a tomb with food, clothes, household items, statues, spells, and a nice wall painting of you enjoying eternity with your wife, your cat, and your favorite goose. But most people couldn't afford this. Full mummification was expensive, so cheaper versions were common: partial embalming, communal tombs, simple graves with minimal preparation. And the risk of decay was real. If the body rotted, the soul might not recognize it. If the tomb collapsed, your name might be lost. If the tomb was robbed, your spirit might starve. Because yes, spirits needed food. Offerings made by descendants, bread, beer, onions, incense were thought to feed the dead. If no one remembered you, you went hungry. So your eternal fate literally depended on how well your children performed family duties. And if you had no children, better hope someone hired a priest to recite spells in your name. Assuming your body was intact and your tomb was undisturbed, your soul then began its journey through the Duat Egyptian underworld. This was not a gentle stroll. The Duat was a chaotic, winding, terrifying dimension filled with rivers of fire, gates guarded by monstrous creatures, upside-down mountains, and very specific challenges. You needed to know passwords, you needed to recite spells, you needed to avoid pits, snakes, fire, and darkness. You also had to ride in Ra's solar bark, help him fight the giant serpent Apophis, and survive all that just to reach the Hall of Judgment. There, your heart was weighed against the feather of Matha, principle of cosmic balance, truth, and order. If your heart was heavier because of lies, crimes, or general unworthiness, it was thrown to Amit, the devourer, part lion, part hippo, part crocodile. You were annihilated, forever, gone. If your heart was light enough, you got to enter the field of reeds and myrrh of the best parts of Egypt, filled with green fields, gentle rivers, plenty of bread, and no taxes. Sounds nice, except you still had to work. Yes, the afterlife had labor, farming, harvesting, plowing. That's why people were buried with Ashabdi, tiny servant statues meant to magically come to life and do the work for you. The rich had hundreds of them, so unless you were buried with an army of tiny dolls, you were back to bending over in the sun, forever. Also, you weren't really alone. Your ancestors watched you. Your descendants prayed to you. The gods evaluated you. And if something went wrong, like someone cursed your name, or your tomb collapsed, or the wrong ritual was done on your behalf, your afterlife could fall apart. You could become a ghost, not a fun ghost. A hungry ghost. A vengeful ghost. A confused spirit who haunted the living, spread disease, or just moaned a lot near riverbanks. Which meant living people had to perform constant maintenance on the dead. Regular offerings, rituals, tomb repairs, and if they didn't, well, the dead might return. Which is why a lot of ancient Egyptian letters survive with things like "Dearest Uncle, I swear I didn't mean to forget the offering. Please stop killing my goats." But let's say everything went right. Your soul passed the test. You made it to the afterlife. You had your own house, your own fields, and unlimited onions. Still, eternity's a long time. And the Egyptian gods weren't exactly hands-off, they expected continued devotion. You didn't just sit around basking in sunlight. You still had responsibilities. The afterlife wasn't freedom. It was just the next phase of cosmic labor. So, yes, death in Egypt wasn't the end, but it wasn't peaceful either. It was a logistical nightmare followed by a spiritual obstacle course followed by a lifetime of magical farm work, and all of it could be undone by one lazy grandchild forgetting your death anniversary. Welcome to the afterlife. It's like real life but slightly more organized, slightly more terrifying, and with more snakes. So now we've reached the end. We've seen the daily miseries of peasants, the spiritual terrors of priests, the crushing obligations of scribes, and the royal disasters of pharaohs. We've survived floods, famine, incestuous succession, magical medicine, hippo rampages, and bureaucratic afterlives. And what did we learn? Mostly that being born in ancient Egypt meant inheriting a life filled with rules. Everything had a rule. How you were born, how you lived, how you dressed, what you could eat, when you could eat it, where you could walk, which gods you prayed to on which days, using which incantations, facing which cardinal direction, while holding which sacred onion. There were rules for farming, rules for grieving, rules for opening jars, rules for placing amulets, rules for naming cats. Even death wasn't an escape from the rules, it was just the beginning of a new rule book, with higher stakes and more crocodiles. And somehow, despite all this, ancient Egypt lasted for thousands of years. Not decades, not centuries, millennia. Dynasties rose and fell. Gods were merged, split, ignored, remembered again. Foreign rulers came and went. Empires crumbled around them. But Egypt remained, in part because the system worked if you were at the top. If you were pharaoh, priest, or landowner, the rules existed to protect you. They preserved your name. They fed your tomb. They justified your power. But if you were a brickmaker, a farmer, a child, bride, a beer brewer with missing teeth and 4 sick goats, the rules weren't safety. They were survival. You obeyed them because not obeying them meant punishment in this life or the next. Sometimes both. And even the elites weren't free. Pharaohs were born into expectations they could never fulfill. They had to be warriors, gods, priests, politicians, and architects. They had to be both eternal and temporarily human. They had to manage floods and star alignments and tax audits. And when they died, they had to pass through the duat without messing up their spell recipe, or else they'd be eaten by a monster with 3 animal heads and a bad attitude. Power didn't make life easier, it made it more stressful. Everyone was watching. Everyone expected perfection. And if you failed, you weren't just forgotten. You were erased, sandblasted from stone, your statues torn down, your name scratched out. And in a world where memory was life, that was the worst fate of all. But maybe the most exhausting part of ancient Egypt was how permanent everything tried to be. Temples built for eternity. Laws written for eternity. Afterlives designed for eternity. You couldn't just live and die and be done. You had to prepare for your name to echo forever. Even if you were a scribe copying lists of fish. Even if you were a housewife grinding grain until your spine curved sideways. Even if you were a mid-level priest whose only job was to wake up a statue every morning and pretend it blinked. The pressure to matter never stopped. It didn't care who you were. And in that way, maybe ancient Egypt feels strangely modern. A society where everyone is told they're important, but only a few ever get remembered. A world obsessed with legacy, with status, with cosmic order, and deeply afraid of being forgotten. But in the end, most were forgotten. Not every pharaoh got a pyramid. Not every laborer got a proper burial. Not every child survived. Not every soul reached paradise. And even those who did, their tombs are empty. Their gods are quiet. Their monuments are tourist attractions. Their legacies are held together by museum glass and shaky translations of Hafi-esque. Because time doesn't care about math. It erodes even the most sacred stone. And maybe that's why we tell these stories. Not because ancient Egypt was glorious. Not because it was wise. But because it was exhausting, beautiful, strange, haunted by its own need to last. And somehow against all odds it kind of did. For better or worse. Mostly worse. But at least it's never boring. So now that we've wandered through deserts, temples, tombs, and crocodile-infested rivers, maybe the question isn't just why it sucked to be a pharaoh or a peasant or a scribe or a goat, but why we're still fascinated by it. Maybe it's because Egypt was a civilization obsessed with legacy. It built monuments designed to last forever, wrote names in stone, and packed the afterlife with furniture and bread. It believed, deeply and unshakably, that life meant nothing without cosmic order and that the gods were always watching. But behind all the divine symbolism and perfectly aligned pyramids was a society full of very tired people. People who worked hard, who worried constantly, who endured absurd levels of ceremony just to go to the bathroom without offending a spirit. People who lived with back pain and bad bread and snakes in their canals. People who feared the gods and their neighbors and probably their own cousins. Egypt was impressive, but it wasn't peaceful. It was beautiful, but it wasn't gentle. Its greatest achievements were carved out by hands that bled, feet that blistered, and minds that spent more time memorizing ritual protocol than asking if any of this really made sense. And for all the glory attributed to its kings, the golden masks, the tomb treasures, the statues so big they blot out the sun, being pharaoh wasn't a dream. It was a full-time job with no retirement plan, political sabotage included, spiritual responsibility required, and success only guaranteed if you were lucky enough to die cleanly and be buried without your priests forgetting the correct incense schedule. Most weren't that lucky. Most didn't get pyramids. Most didn't even get names, we remember. But still, they built something that lasted, for better or worse. Mostly worse. And maybe, in some tired, dusty way, that's what makes it worth remembering. Because ancient Egypt wasn't just a tale of greatness, it was a place where people tried, failed, prayed, worked, suffered, and repeated everything exactly as they were told. Every single day. For thousands of years, just so the world wouldn't fall apart. And if that isn't relatable, nothing is. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. Or don't. There might be a ghost behind you wondering why you forgot to light incense last Tuesday.